gives you some background about Darwin and the other researchers, the other scientists of the time that helped influence his theory, shape what he came up with, the whole theory of natural selection. You remember when we talked about DNA that there were 3 groups of scientists that did the whole thing with determining that DNA was the transforming factor. That DNA was what is passing the information from one generation to the next. And then there were 3 more teams of scientists who figured out the structure of DNA. So we have Darwin, and then we have these other scientists. And if you turn to page 8, I believe, in your study guide, there's a nice little table where you can compile all your information, and then you can go back. The first 2 guys here are Hutton and Lyell, and they theorized, they hypothesized, they researched, they studied about the Earth and how old the Earth was and how the Earth had land masses and shapes on the land masses the way they were. And so they didn't really think about species, animals, plants and animals. They thought about Earth, they're geologists more or less. So they both thought, in order for our Earth to look the way it does, it has to be way older than everybody thinks. So that's the first thing. And this is both of them together, which kind of gives you, I'll split them off now, but they both studied Earth. They both said that Earth is way older. In order for the Earth to look the way it does, Earth is way older than everybody else tended to think at the time. Hutton looked at geological features like mountains, valleys, layers of rock that seemed to be bent or folded, and he pointed out that there were different kinds of rocks that are formed from different processes. The first type of rock is igneous rock, formed from molten lava. It comes out of the volcanoes. Then as it cools, entire islands have been formed from a volcanic eruption that has the lava has cooled and formed land. So that's one way. And then extra land layering on top of other land from volcanic eruptions on already existing landforms. So this is Hutton. He talks about different landforms, different land masses. He talked about sedimentary rock. This isn't as good of a picture as I thought when I picked it, but you can kind of see the layers here in this middle structure. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon. You can see that there are layers upon layers of rock. So sediment has piled in. The pressure of the layers above compress it, and it petrifies and forms rock. So you see 2 things going on. The piling up of sediments, and then you also see the river running through, that's Colorado River running through the Grand Canyon, that's wearing away. That's the erosion process right there. So we have two different processes that shape the Earth's surface going on in this same slide. So that's Hutton. Still with Hutton, he's talking about how mountain ranges are formed, and then how they can be worn down by rain, wind, heat, and cold. So if you think about it, we talk about plate tectonics, or all kind of the land masses are floating on these plates. When they come apart, when they move apart, there are rifts, there are fault lines that are formed. When they come together, there's a big one in Iceland right now, actually. And then when they come together, there's no place else for them to go but kind of smash into each other and buckle up. That's how mountain ranges are formed. And if you look at the two main mountain ranges in the United States, we have the Rocky Mountains, there's the Sierra Nevada too, but the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, geologists think that the Appalachian Mountains are much older than the Rocky Mountains because the erosion thing, the wind, heat, rain, and cold, has had a longer amount of time to kind of soften those mountains, wear them down. They're not as tall, they're not as jagged, if you compare them to what you see out west in the Rocky Mountains. So the processes that have formed the mountains to create those jagged peaks has happened more recently, and also that there hasn't been as much time for the erosion to wear them down. He talked about how these processes happen very slowly, again reinforcing that he thinks the Earth is older than most other people thought at the time. And this isn't on the test, but the concept called deep time is just, he was saying that our brains, it's difficult for our brains to comprehend exactly how long, like, billions of years is, which I think is actually true. Then we have Lyell, the second guy in that table. He had principles of geology that he talked about. The big word for Lyell is uniformitarianism. The idea that the geological processes that are happening today, earthquakes, land masses moving, erosion, all that good stuff, his hypothesis is that all of that was what was shaping Earth millions of years ago as well. He talks about volcanoes releasing lava just like they do today. He talks about rivers eroding and digging channels and carving canyons just as they do today. So this is uniformitarianism. Again, just to re-emphasize, they're both saying the Earth is much older than everybody thought at the time. Don't have to worry about anything else on this slide. Just this area right here. Lyell's principles, Darwin felt like he saw in action. He witnessed an earthquake when he was in South America, and he saw a shoreline, a stretch of rocky shoreline, lift up like 3 meters, 9 feet out of the sea. And he saw that with it, whatever was clinging to that rocky stretch, like the mussels, the sea animals, the barnacles, whatever, were all clinging to it. They were lifted up out of the water. And so what he transposed that over to is when he was looking in the mountains in South America and saw fossils of shellfish, marine animals, thousands of feet above sea level, he thought, what I just saw over there, maybe that's what happened years ago here in the mountains. So he tried to draw make these relationships, draw these connections between things. And again, to reemphasize, may or may not be true. Makes sense though. And then he thought about Earth's early history first, and then he started thinking about life. So if Earth can change over time, could the same thing happen with living things? Then we have Lamarck in that table. Lamarck was the first guy to kind of say, we see species change over time, and he tried to come up with an explanation for why. People started discovering fossils, taking a closer look at them, wondering, okay, what's going on here? And what Lamarck said is that organisms could change by using or not using their body parts, different parts of their bodies. So, and then furthermore, if an individual organism changed, that change would be passed on to their offspring. So he theorized, or he hypothesized, that change over time was due to a change in an individual organism that happened in that particular organism's lifetime. The classic example that's given is giraffes. So he said his hypothesis, his theory, was that giraffes long ago didn't have really long necks. They had short necks like horses or zebras or whatever, but the vegetation they needed to feed on was way up high, and so they would stretch their necks, and within that particular mommy or daddy giraffe, over their lifetime, because they're stretching their neck, their neck became ever so slightly longer, and then that change would be passed on to the offspring. What?
Isn't that like pretty enough to be true now though, because like those African ladies who do the neck stretching, like their kids are born
Yes.
normal?
Yeah. Okay, so we know this isn't true. Think about what you've learned about heritability, about genetics, about passing things on from one generation to the next. Because I stretch my neck, because the African ladies stretch their neck, because somebody puts gauges in their earlobes and gets a big hole in their earlobes, will their children have the big holes in the earlobes? No, why not? It's not a change in the DNA. It's not a genetic change. It's a structural change. We can call it an acquired change, which is the term that we're going to use here. It's an acquired change, but it's not something that is changed in the DNA. The other goofy thing, it's kind of funny, Lamarck thought that there was free will and consciousness in all organisms. He said that all organisms have an inborn urge to become more complex and perfect, and so they are willing themselves to change and acquire features to help them live more successfully in their environments. So he thought that there were, these organisms, these living things are willing themselves to change. I need to reach that vegetation up high, and so I'm going to stretch my neck to make it longer. That there was a consciousness aspect to this change over time, which is a little bit lofty. As we're talking about anything other than humans having consciousness. So there's another example. This is a black-necked stilt. Black-necked stilt has these long legs here. So what Lamarck would say is that this bird would wade deeper into the water to find food and would stretch up to keep its head out of water, and so over time its legs would become ever so slightly longer, and those ever so slightly longer legs would be passed on to its offspring. So its legs would grow a little longer and then pass it on to the offspring. And then same thing would happen in the next generation. The other examples, flightless birds, so the wings would become smaller. And these are the key phrases here with Lamarck's theories or hypotheses. These are called acquired characteristics, something that's acquired over an organism's lifetime, and he said that those could be inherited. So the catchphrase here is inheritance of acquired characteristics. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. We already talked about the fallacies with these hypotheses. There's not an inborn drive to become more perfect, and acquired traits cannot be passed on because it's not a genetic change. It's not a change in the DNA. So these are the problems with Lamarck's thinking. Yeah. Here it is. Here it is. So the good part about what Lamarck did was he explained evolution using natural processes. He saw that there was change over time, like he showed that there was change over time, or he recognized there was a change over time, and that there's a link between organisms' environment and its body structures. So it was just the mechanism of how organisms change over time that was, like I said, a little lofty, a little incorrect. He thought that organisms could will themselves to change, not so much, and that they have this innate desire to become perfect, not so much. But he saw that there was a link between environment and body structure. Did that answer your question? You guys have heard about Thomas Malthus in social studies class, right? Yep. Captain Doomsday? Okay. Well, if you haven't heard about him yet, I think it's coming up. It's funny because my dad, over the years, the scientist, the microbiologist, has talked a lot about this kind of thing, like our population's too big, we're getting overcrowded, we're going to run out of space, we're going to run out of food, we're going to run out of resources. My dad, Captain Doomsday, also. So last year I was like, Dad, have you ever heard of Thomas Malthus? And he said no, and so I forwarded him the wiki of Thomas Malthus, and he's like, this dude was smart. This is exactly what I've been saying. But the thing is, so what Thomas Malthus says is that, and it's true about all populations, there's supposed to be what's called a carrying capacity. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll learn about carrying capacity in March or April when the weather's a little bit nicer. But there's supposed to be a leveling off. Of any population, there's a limit to how much they can grow. But somehow we humans keep outfoxing it, which is a good thing, sort of, I guess. I mean, we want to keep all our loved ones alive and stuff, but at some point we're going to have to pay the piper. That's Thomas Malthus. So what he said, and before even the year 1800, our country was in its relative infancy, he said, we're going to run out of space, we're going to run out of food, there's going to be a problem here. And to a certain extent, worldwide, it has happened, but not everywhere yet. So Darwin took this about human populations, what Malthus said about human populations, and started wondering, well, what about this overpopulation that's happening with production of offspring in nature? Oak trees, it says, can produce thousands of seeds each summer. Acorns, that's what we call them. Oak trees' seeds are acorns. One oyster, and I think of more of like in Finding Nemo, the little in my picture in my head, the little cluster of eggs before the barracuda comes, and there's just one little egg that's left, and that's Nemo. But if you think of it, millions of eggs. Fish produce millions of eggs each year, hundreds at a spawn. Most offspring die for whatever reason. The squirrel eats the acorn. The squirrel buries the acorn over the winter and then remembers where it is and digs it back up and eats it. There's some acorns that survive because they're buried and they're forgotten about, and they grow into an oak tree. So the vast majority of offspring don't survive. You saw in Nemo, if you watched Finding Nemo, the vast majority, all except one, of the little fishy eggs, the little clownfish eggs, were eaten by the barracuda. There's one, Nemo, that survived. So, there's some chance involved to this. There's a lot of chance involved to this, to be honest with you. But what Darwin wondered is, of those organisms that survive to grow up into adulthood, there are some that are going to make it and some that are not. And so what's the difference between those? Why do some individuals survive and others do not? What? Oh, what? Okay. What happened?
When you switch slides,
it wiped?
it just scared me.
Oh, okay, sorry. Maybe if you're in the comfort of your own home, it'll feel a little bit more natural. So, artificial selection, we talked about selective breeding. The earliest form of genetic technology, selective breeding, I talked to you about when I pick my tomatoes and harvest the seeds in the summertime. I get the seeds from the tomatoes that ripen first. So hopefully in the next generation, I get early ripening tomatoes so that I can have a longer time period of fresh tomatoes in the summer. So breeders do this. We talked about all this. Selective breeding, inbreeding, hybridization last chapter. This was going on in Darwin's age. This was going on way before Darwin's time. But what he saw is that people were taking advantage of the natural variation in species, hand-picking the best characteristics from those species and breeding those individuals together so that those genes are the ones that get passed on. That's called artificial selection. Darwin did this with pigeons. I don't know what's going on with this guy right here. I got to start using the circle. This looks uncomfortable to me, this guy right here. I'm not sure what's going on there with his neck.
An egg stuck in his throat.
Yeah, something. Softball? I don't know.
How does he not fall over? He's a little top heavy.
So these are different. These are called fancy pigeons. I didn't even know fancy and pigeons could go in the same word, same phrase. But these are fancy pigeons, and what you saw, different people who owned pigeons would breed them in different ways to get these crazy characteristics like this thing to stand out. I don't even know what's going on there. But this is artificial selection. So Darwin thought, okay, if we can do this in captivity, what happens, what goes on in nature? Most of the time, scientists thought that variations were defects. There was a negative connotation to a variation, that everything should be the same. And if there were variations, that was a bad thing. We've talked about mutations in here, the M word, and how mutations we've talked about for the most part being a bad thing or a negative thing, but superhuman powers and other mutations can really help the human race. So, nobody was listening to that? You didn't even hear that I said superhuman powers. Okay. Nothing. Okay. That was sarcasm. But there can be variations that are advantageous. We talked about the heterozygous, the people who are heterozygous for sickle cell disease, the sickle cell trait. It makes them immune to malaria. They can't catch malaria. People who were heterozygous were carriers for the cystic fibrosis gene, were immune. They couldn't get typhoid fever. So there are advantageous mutations. They didn't call them mutations then, they called them variations. And this variation is the raw material for evolution. This is what allows organisms to change over time.
Whoa.
There it is again. All right.